What will he regret? 8:42 a.m. The dashboard clock blinked the time as Kendrick Robinson pulled into the parking lot in front of the Greenville City Courthouse, South Carolina. The morning sun stretched long, winding shadows across the black asphalt. Kendrick took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, Kendrick's life revolved around discipline and preparation. He lived within the boundaries of case files, deadlines, and precision. But this morning, everything seemed to conspire against him. Today's task wasn't particularly complicated, just a routine administrative complaint about a property tax adjustment. The city had imposed an unreasonable increase on the house his grandmother had left him. But to Kendrick, it wasn't just a property. It was the heart of his childhood, the place where his grandmother taught him right from wrong through breakfast-time stories and stern but loving glances. Wearing a crisp white shirt under a dark blue suit, Kendrick looked every bit the seasoned attorney. Even so, the morning had been a mess. An urgent call from Washington about a human trafficking case had forced him to pause and respond to a last-minute motion from the defense attorney. Only after replying to the investigative team had he rushed to the city courthouse, well aware he was cutting it close. As he climbed the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. At the U.S. Attorney's Office, the judge in Greenville is notorious for not tolerating tardiness. Be careful. Kendrick slipped the phone into his briefcase and exhaled gently. He wasn't worried. He came armed with truth and evidence, his trusted weapons. Still, there was something about that message that made him pause for just a second. Then he shook it off and stepped inside. The city courthouse was nothing like the federal courts Kendrick usually worked in. Pale beige walls, scratched wooden benches, and an air tinged with the scent of coffee and old paper, a smell that whispered of time itself. But don't let appearances fool you. This place was running at full throttle. People bustled by with thick stacks of paperwork, faces clouded with worry about traffic tickets, petty disputes, or tangled laws they barely understood. Kendrick checked his watch. 8:50 a.m., exactly 10 minutes left, just enough time to find the courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway where whispers and footsteps tangled into a hurried soundtrack. Room 204, Judge Charles Whitman. The name gleamed in raised brass letters on the door. Kendrick adjusted his tie, took a breath, and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was nearly full. He found a seat near the back, opened his briefcase, and began reviewing his file and every copy, every note. Then the side door opened. Judge Charles Whitman entered. Tall, silver-made, with ice-blue eyes that sliced like blades, and without saying a word, he silenced the entire room. The court officer's voice rang out, "All rise!" Chairs scraped the floor as everyone stood, Kendrick included, back straight, eyes fixed on every movement. Judge Whitman took his seat, scanning the courtroom with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through people. He began calling the cases in order. His voice was steady, precise, emotionless, as if clearing away everything unnecessary, leaving only law and fact behind. Kendrick kept watching, and just then, a middle-aged man in a suit slipped in, a few minutes late. A quiet figure sliding through the door like a shadow. Moments later, a young woman in simple clothes found a spot in the back row. No one, not a single person, was acknowledged by the judge, not even a glance, let alone a reprimand. Kendrick made a mental note of it but kept his focus on the case file. He was here to handle something that seemed simple, and he wasn't about to let anything personal interfere with that. 9:15 a.m. A voice called out, "Kendrick Robinson." He stood, neatly folded his documents, and walked calmly to the front, despite knowing he was a few minutes late. He maintained a composed exterior, but within seconds he felt a shift in the room's energy. Judge Whitman looked up, his gaze freezing the air. "You're late, Mr. Robinson." His voice was sharp as a blade, slicing through the quiet. "Do you believe this court's time is worth less than your own?" The courtroom went dead silent. No one moved. Kendrick could feel dozens of eyes locked onto him. He raised a hand slightly, palm outward, a respectful, conciliatory gesture. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to an urgent matter at the federal level." But Whitman didn't let him finish. "An excuse is not a justification," he cut in, his tone glacial. "This court operates on discipline and respect. If you can't grasp that, perhaps you need to reconsider your professional priorities." Kendrick stood tall. He didn't react. He was no stranger to being tested. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "I understand the importance of punctuality. And if I may, I'd like to present the file regarding the property tax." "Hold on." Whitman raised a hand, his voice colder than before. "First, we need to address your contempt of court. Being late undermines the seriousness of these proceedings. You are fined $750. The words landed like a hammer on an anvil. Clear. Final. Kendrick bit his lower lip lightly. He didn't flinch, but inside a tide of frustration was rising. Around him murmurs began to ripple. Some people leaned in to whisper. A few glanced at him with surprise or sympathy. "Your Honor," Kendrick tried again, his voice steady, "if I may explain," but the gavel struck again. "Denied." "Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Kendrick stepped back and returned to his seat, but his mind was no longer on the tax file. Something was off. Very off. He glanced at the others who had arrived late earlier. Not one had been called out, let alone fined. The disparity was glaring, and he wasn't going to stay silent. He opened his briefcase, not for the tax documents, but for a blank notepad. He pulled out a pen and began writing. His strokes were quick, sharp, filled with the cool logic of someone well-versed in courtroom combat. Judge Whitman continued, calling the next cases, his tone unchanged, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But for Kendrick, this was no longer just a routine hearing. Sitting in the back row, his attention shifted away from paperwork toward the system itself, its gears and flaws grinding visibly in front of him. And inside him, a new resolve was taking shape. The young woman who had slipped in late earlier now sat in the front row, scrolling through her phone with the nonchalance of someone at a coffee shop. No one addressed her, not even a sideways glance of disapproval. A man in a gray blazer, who had clearly entered after the session began, was now presenting his case. No fine, no lecture. The same gavel that had come crashing down on Kendrick had suddenly gone soft for everyone else. He didn't need to take notes to see the imbalance. This wasn't coincidence. This was a system, and he had seen systems like this, far too many times. The prosecutor in him kicked in, analyzing the moment like a crime scene. $750 for being a few minutes late to a municipal tax hearing? Excessive. And more than a penalty, it was a direct blow to his dignity. His eyes swept across the room, reading faces. Some looked confused, others surprised. A few held quiet, sympathetic stares. Everyone saw it. No one dared to speak. "Next case," Judge Whitman called out again. "Kendrick Robinson," for the second time. Kendrick stood, calm, measured, head held high. He stepped forward once more, Whitman's eyes fixed on him like a silent dare. "You going to push back again?" Kendrick began, Your Honor, I bring detailed documentation regarding an unjust tax reassessment on property that has belonged to my family for decades. He opened the file, each page neatly arranged, complete with photographs and charts. This is the original tax assessment. It remained stable for 5 years. The new reassessment shows a 30% increase, issued without notice and with no clear explanation. Judge Whitman leaned back slightly, his disinterest obvious. I'll review it when the time is appropriate, but your tardiness this morning is still a matter that must be addressed. He braced his hands on the armrests, his gaze growing colder. Do you truly believe that just because of your federal position, you have the right to disregard order here? Kendrick's expression didn't shift. His voice was low but firm. Your Honor, I meant no disrespect. The matter I handled this morning involved a human trafficking operation, and I trust we can all agree that's the kind of crime that warrants urgent attention. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained unchanged. No matter how noble the reason, rules are still rules. The court operates on a foundation of order. Anyone who breaks that order must be held accountable. But for Kendrick, it wasn't the words themselves that unsettled him, it was the way they were delivered, like a verdict handed down before he even spoke. A sharp realization settled in Kendrick's chest. Here, his title meant nothing, his record meant nothing, his reason wasn't being heard. He drew a deep breath. Your Honor, he said, slowly, clearly, I fully respect the rules, but I have one question. Are those rules being applied equally to everyone in this room? A quiet ripple passed through the courtroom. Some turned their heads, others held their breath. Judge Whitman stiffened. His face flushed red. Are you questioning the fairness of this court, Mr. Robinson? Kendrick stood firm. His voice was even, neither sharp nor submissive. I'm simply asking for clarity, not just for myself, but for everyone present here today. The gavel slammed down again. This court does not accept such accusations. The fine stands. Kendrick gave a slight bow of the head, his face unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, feeling every eye on him, some wary, some quietly respectful. He knew this wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Kendrick was no stranger to the subtle biases wrapped in a cloak of authority. He had seen it, had lived it, his quiet prejudice embedded in different layers of the legal system. But this morning, something felt different. It wasn't just a cold stare or a reprimand for being late. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for him to act. Kendrick quietly pulled out his phone and bowed his head, jotting down notes about what had just unfolded. He wasn't finished, not even close. In that exact moment, he made a silent decision. This doesn't end here. The hearing continued. Names were still called, files still flipped. But Kendrick's presence and what had just happened had shifted something in the room. He noticed an older black man in the front row, thin and weathered, turned to look at him, his eyes filled with understanding, with solidarity. The court clerk, whose fingers had been typing non-stop, suddenly slowed, her gaze flickering with hesitation. A young law student in the corner, head bent over a notebook, scribbled furiously, her face a mix of shock and newfound resolve. No one said a word, but everyone had seen it. Everyone understood. When the hearing ended, people began filing out. Kendrick didn't move right away. He stood still, watching. The way they left the room, carrying with them a silence heavy as stone. This wasn't about a tax form anymore. It wasn't about a $750.00 fine. This was about fairness, about the functioning or the failure of an entire system. When Kendrick stepped outside the courthouse, the fresh air didn't wash away the weight he carried. Outside, the world looked the same. People walking by, case files, lawyers, police officers, the churn of everyday business, as if nothing unusual had happened. But in Kendrick's mind, everything was shifting. He paused on the courthouse steps and pulled out his phone. His finger hovered over a familiar contact, his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Judge Whitman sat in silence, his hands gripping the armrests. For the first time in years, his authority had been openly questioned, right there in his own courtroom. His voice came lower than usual. "You may leave, Mr. Robinson." Kendrick nodded, gathered his documents, and turned to go. But just before exiting, he paused and looked directly at the bench. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll make sure this matter is addressed through proper channels." As Kendrick stepped out of that courtroom for the second time that morning, every eye followed him. No one said a word. But everyone knew something had shifted. This wasn't just a voice speaking up for himself, it was a voice challenging a system that had grown too comfortable in silence. This was no longer just about Kendrick. It was a challenge to a structure, one used to unchecked authority, to bias hidden beneath the robe of law, and to the habit of never looking inward. Outside the courthouse, Kendrick walked slowly, pulling out his phone. He began typing, line by line, detail by detail, everything that had happened, every glance, every word, every telling silence, all of it documented. He hit send, and he knew this was just the beginning. The email traveled faster than he expected. The next morning his phone buzzed. The caller, Julia Harper, his direct superior, a veteran prosecutor known for her zero-tolerance stance on systemic misconduct. Her voice held a mix of curiosity and gravity. "Kendrick, I've read your report. If what you've described is accurate, this isn't an isolated incident." "I'm certain it's not," Kendrick replied. "What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before, and I know I'm not the only one." On the other end, Julia exhaled deeply. "I'm contacting the Judicial Oversight Committee. This will need to be handled carefully. Badly, thoroughly. Start pulling everything you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready." The call ended. But Kendrick's real work had just begun. He spent hours reviewing every detail from the hearing, not just what was said, but what wasn't. He combed through public records, fine logs, court transcripts, case stats from Judge Whitman's bench over the years. And then the numbers began to speak. For the same minor violations, black defendants were routinely fined significantly more than white defendants, while white individuals often received only warnings or symbolic penalties. People of color paid, and paid hard. Kendrick reached out to colleagues, local attorneys, legal aid groups, anyone who had ever set foot in Whitman's courtroom. And then the tide surged. Stories came in like a flood. A young black woman fined heavily for a parking violation, while a white man with 3 repeat offenses was simply warned. An attorney recounted how her Latino client was cut off repeatedly during his defense, never allowed to fully explain his appeal. An elderly black man confessed that every time he entered that courtroom, he felt guilty before he even spoke. The Judicial Oversight Committee launched an official investigation. They descended on Greenville's courthouse, collecting over a decade of case records, interviewing staff, recording witness statements. Then, a surprise witness came forward. Mrs. Thompson, the longtime court clerk. Her hands trembled as she pulled a worn notebook from an old drawer. "I started writing things down every time something didn't feel right. I didn't dare speak out. Until now." Inside the notebook, dates, names, circumstances, all recorded with painstaking care, a quiet ledger of injustice. Then came James Wilson, the courthouse security guard. 15 years I'd been here. I saw it clear as day, the way he treated people differently. But I thought there was nothing I could do. And then the story spilled beyond the courthouse walls. The young law student, the one who had sat quietly in the corner that day, posted about the incident on social media. Her post went viral within hours. Hundreds of people flooded the comments, sharing similar experiences, voices laced with fear, anger, and a desperate longing for change. The media picked it up. Bias in Greenville courtroom, federal prosecutor challenges long-standing judge. Headlines dominated local newspapers. The story spread across the state. Kendrick's phone buzzed constantly. Reporters, attorneys, past victims, civil rights groups. He declined all interviews. He chose silence, for now reserving his voice for the investigation. And Judge Whitman? Rumors swirled that he'd been called into several closed-door meetings with the Judicial Review Board. Outwardly, he remained composed, publicly denying all allegations. But privately, he was beginning to realize this time he couldn't sweep it under the rug. By the end of the first week, Kendrick's phone rang again. It was Julia Harper, and this time her voice carried shock. The numbers are staggering. We've confirmed it. Black defendants in Judge Whitman's courtroom were fined 3 times more than white defendants for the same infractions. Her tone dropped. This is systemic, not isolated. What's our next move? Kendrick asked. We're bringing it to the State Judicial Council. And Kendrick? She paused. The media won't let go of this. Be ready. Kendrick nodded to no one, the weight pressing on his chest like a wave. But he didn't back down because the truth was too important and too long buried. By the second weekend, Kendrick's name had reached national headlines. Headline, Systemic Bias Exposed. Federal Prosecutor Demands Equal Justice. On social media, thousands posted with hashtags, "Think it's equal justice now?" Be essentially reasonable in courts. Justice should be blind. The story was no longer just Kendrick's. It became a symbol for everyone who'd ever walked out of a courtroom silenced by injustice. As public outcry grew, Kendrick stayed grounded, working quietly with the Judicial Oversight Committee. The evidence wasn't just data, it was people, it was memory, it was scars. A young mother fined $500, 0 cents, for arguing over an incorrect zoning ticket, even though she had clear proof of the city's mistake. A young black man publicly shamed in court, his character and morals questioned, only for a white defendant with the exact same violation to be dismissed minutes later. Local advocacy groups mobilized. They held rallies outside the Greenville courthouse. Banners filled the air. Justice shouldn't discriminate. End the bias now. Though he avoided the media spotlight, Kendrick could feel the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for one case, but for the belief that this system could correct itself if someone had the courage to stand up. The pressure mounted. Long-time court employees began to speak up. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, who had quietly documented patterns for years, became a key witness in the investigation. "I used to think no one would listen," she said during a public hearing. "But now that the truth is coming to light, I can't stay silent anymore." James Wilson, the security guard, appearing on television for the first time, spoke with steady resolve. "I watched this happen for years. I knew it was wrong, and it's time it ends." And Judge Whitman? At first he denied everything, claimed he'd been misunderstood. that things were taken out of context, and that court procedures were always followed. But the evidence kept piling up, and for the first time in over 2 decades on the bench, he was forced to make a public statement. I regret any actions that may have caused unintended harm. But the apology rang hollow. Amid the media storm and explosive headlines, Kendrick remained grounded. He continued his work at the U.S. Attorney's Office, not for the spotlight, not for applause, but because he knew real responsibility doesn't end with one courtroom hearing. At the same time, he couldn't ignore what was pouring into his office. Emails, handwritten letters, calls from across the country. Some offered support, others shared emotional confessions from strangers. I've witnessed injustice like this for decades, but I stayed silent. Thank you for doing what so many of us never dared to. From a retired attorney in Alabama, the movement spread beyond Greenville. Other judges across South Carolina came under scrutiny. Old case files, once gathering dust, were being reopened. The State Judicial Oversight Committee announced a sweeping expansion of their investigation, this time targeting local court systems where bias wasn't an accident, but a structure. By the end of the month, the preliminary report was released. Its conclusion was stark. Judge Whitman's actions were not isolated. They reflect a broken system, neglected and tolerated across generations. The committee proposed sweeping reforms, mandatory bias training for all state judges, regular audits of sentencing and fines, creation of a community-led independent review board. Under mounting pressure and facing the possibility of a public disciplinary hearing, Whitman resigned. In a brief statement, he said, "In the best interests of this court and the community, I choose to step down." Some called it an indirect confession. Others saw it as a necessary first step toward healing. For Kendrick, it wasn't a victory, it was confirmation. He never celebrated because he knew the real fight was only beginning. Then came the invitations. Law schools, legal conferences, community organizations, everyone wanted to hear Kendrick's story. And he told it not to glorify himself, but to spark action. At one speaking event after Kendrick's address, a young black law student approached him, eyes bright, voice steady. "You showed me that the law isn't just about rules. It's about people. You gave me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled. His reply was simple. "The fight is just beginning, but if each of us does our part, this system will change." 3 months after that fateful morning, the Greenville courthouse looked different. The once dull yellow walls had been repainted bright clean. A new welcome desk had been installed, staffed by people who greeted every visitor warmly. Staffs in multiple languages now directed citizens to legal aid services, resources many never even knew they had a right to access. And next to the entrance, a small but powerful plaque had been mounted. Equal justice is everyone's right. Inside the courthouse, the change ran even deeper. Judge Whitman no longer sat on the bench. His replacement, a young judge known for fairness and transparency, was welcomed by the community. But more importantly, people had begun to speak. The forgotten were finally being heard. What was once considered normal was no longer accepted. And Kendrick, in a very real way, I was accepted into this dialogue. Were you to help us? He didn't become a hero. He didn't chase politics. He didn't seek glory. He simply did the right thing at the right time, in the right way. And that was enough to change an entire city. Systemic reforms officially launched. Every courthouse staff member, from judges to clerks to security officers, was required to undergo bias training led by top experts. They weren't just learning how to recognize implicit bias in decision-making. They were learning how to change. Kendrick stood quietly at the back of the courtroom, his former battleground. The room had been renovated, fresh paint, new seats, softer light. But what mattered most to him was who was listening. He was invited to speak to a group of local judges and attorneys, those who now carried the weight of a system he once had to stand against. Inside, he felt a mix of pride and caution, because he knew this wasn't the end. The journey was far from over. Beyond Greenville, the ripple spread. Other communities in South Carolina began auditing their court systems. Then came neighboring states, and judicial councils across the region began mandatory reviews focusing on racial disparities and sentencing gaps. Independent oversight boards were formed, made up of former defendants, attorneys, and grassroots activists. Transparency was no longer a slogan. It was becoming standard. Kendrick's office buzzed with purpose. That $750.00 fine from that fateful morning was now framed and hung above his desk, not as a trophy, but as an unshakable reminder of why he started. Beneath it was a photo of a group of young law students who had founded a civil rights clinic in his name. Their smiles carried belief or a sense of duty greater than any title. James Wilson, the once silent security guard, now taught ethics courses for court personnel. In one session, he looked straight at the class. Our job isn't just to maintain order. It's to make sure everyone who walks in here is treated like a human being. If you see something wrong, say something. Silence is complicity. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk with the quiet notebook in the drawer, now led the courthouse's ethics and accountability training. She wasn't just correcting past wrongs. She was training the next generation so those same mistakes wouldn't repeat. As for Kendrick, his influence reached beyond courtrooms. He began teaching a seminar at the local law school. Ethics and Civil Rights in the Justice System. Every session was packed. Students lingered after class to ask one powerful, simple question: what can I do to help make this system fairer? One afternoon, a student approached him, clutching a notebook full of reform ideas. "Professor," they asked, "what's the most important thing we can do?" Kendrick paused, meeting the fire in the student's eyes. The same fire he once had on his first day in law. And he answered, "Don't stay silent, not even once. And when you see something wrong, don't wait for someone else to do the right thing. Be that person." He stepped into the hallway, bathed in soft evening light streaming through the courthouse windows. Next to the wooden doors hung a new sign. Its letters clear and bold: "Equal justice is everyone's right." Kendrick paused, hand resting gently over his heart. He didn't need anyone to tell him he had changed the system, because he knew real change doesn't come from applause. It comes from quiet, timely, unwavering action. And this time, the system changed because someone dared to stand,